Welcome back to Tech Talks. So, as mentioned in part 2 of Tech Talks, we're going to be revisiting the 7 movements that we covered and discuss variations of those movements that can be used to enhance the overall performance of the base movement.
Yeah, I think the hinge pattern, everyone always just thinks it's just a deadlift or an RDL, but if we look at training, in my training as a secondary movement or accessory movement to hinge work, I'll do like sumo deadlifts or snatch grip deadlifts and all of these to make my deadlift itself stronger. And then to work the hamstrings, we've got barbell RDLs, Romanian deadlifts. You've got dumbbell work, dumbbell RDLs, and you can even do a split stance RDL. So there's so much variation when it comes to hinge patterns. But yeah.
And Kim, for you personally, what personally is your, let's say maybe like your 2 favorite variations in hinge patterns that you use?
Hands down a barbell RDL because I can load it quite heavy for my strength work. And second to that, for more of a hypertrophy movement, I like to do a single leg RDL with a dumbbell. So nice. Single leg dumbbell RDLs. Those are my 2. Like, if you had to tell me, go train on your own, don't follow a program, and I want you to focus on some hinge work, those are the 2 I'd focus on.
Oh, nice, solid.
Yeah.
All right, so what we're going to get into as well is discussing strength is not just an adaptation in terms of moving more load. Strength is also a skill. There's a really big skill component to strength in terms of how you perform the movement to be as efficient as possible. And a lot of strength movements are compound movements. This means multiple muscles working together to achieve this. And so some variations target certain muscle groups better than others, and making sure that you're strengthening those muscle groups makes the overall movement better. So, for example, if we want to use a variation of a hinge that incorporates more quads and adductors, because predominantly a lot of hinge-based movements favor our posterior chain, our glutes and our hamstrings. Something like a sumo deadlift is a fantastic way of getting a hinge pattern that actually does put a bit of more demand on our quads due to generally the more upright torso position, as well as our adductors due to that wide stance. Fantastic variation. Takes some getting used to from a technique point of view, pretty different to conventional deadlift, but a fantastic one. It is definitely a variation to throw into the mix, even if you're still competing or prefer conventional deadlift. Sumo deadlift is a great variation to throw into the mix and draw some benefits from there. Then if we look at our deadlift and position and control, deficit deadlifts or snatch grip deadlifts, great way to be able to coach yourself on getting the hips in a lower position. That snatch grip or the deficit means you have to drop lower than what you generally would. This helps coach you in getting the hips lower. So for those of you that battle with your hips being out of position, throw in there, yes, does mean you're going to have to lighten that load. Incorporating those 2 movements with something like some tempo work, great way to learn to have better hip placement and get to the position you need to make your deadlift more successful. Then obviously if we want to target hamstrings and glutes, isolate them a little bit more, a Romanian deadlift or stiff leg deadlift, fantastic. So stiff leg deadlift is going to get you to have the barbell hit all the way to the bottom of the ground. It's going to be a dead stop and then drawing up. This is a great way to improve explosiveness. And then if we're looking at our Romanian deadlift, basically copy paste the movement, except the bar isn't going to reach all the way down. We're going to keep constant tension on the hamstrings. Great tool to use when focusing on hypertrophy blocks. So depending whether you want to focus on hypertrophy, adding mass, or if you want to focus on explosive power off the floor, you can use those 2 movements. Very little difference in them, but use them at different points of your training. And then, to me, a seriously essential variation that has to be in your training and when it comes to hinge work, and that is unilateral hinge work. That is where we essentially load one side of the body, either loading one side of the body or taking one leg out of the equation. So doing a single leg deadlift or a B stance or a kickstand, anything like that where one leg is forward, the one leg is back, going into the hinge. What we're trying to do there is help better improve stabilization of your pelvis. So your core is going to have to do some really good work in terms of keeping your hips nice and steady. And that should be the focus when it comes to your single leg work, is don't load it so much that your hips are all out of place, but your hamstrings feeling a good burn. I think at the end of the day, if you want to go for hypertrophy, I would still recommend actually rather just going a bilateral movement. Use unilateral movements with a weight low enough that you can maintain control of your hips, but high enough that it is a challenge to do so. So you may find that, yes, your hamstrings and your glutes aren't going to feel as burned out. So a great way to place it and a great place to put single leg work when it comes to hinge patterns in your training. A little bit towards the back end, so you've already accumulated a bit more fatigue in your glutes and your hamstrings. Therefore, the lighter load that will be a challenge for stabilizing your hips will still be a little bit more of a challenge on the hamstrings and glutes. Super essential though. What you'll generally find is, myself personally, when I do deadlifts, my right side, right QL, tends to be pretty problematic. So hip stability tends to be a little bit of an issue for me, and single leg work, really important. I'm busy with a block right now, actually, where I don't have as much single leg work in, and I genuinely notice the difference in my conventional deadlift. I'm battling to tolerate the increases in load and volume as much as I do when I've got my single leg work in there.
Yeah. And if we take a look at powerlifting, for example, when it comes to hinge work, the two deadlifts that we mentioned is conventional and sumo. And a lot of the times you find conventional deadlifters like myself don't like sumo, and the sumo guys don't like conventional. And that's because it shows you where your weaknesses lie.
100%.
Which is my quads and my adductors, which is why I don't like sumo. So if you don't like a movement, it's probably because that's where you have your weakness. So you should add it in as the secondary function or the secondary movement in your training, because ultimately it will make your conventional stronger.
Definitely. And I think maybe that's also where sometimes people don't like the variations, is that it's not the strongest of movements. You have to put the ego aside. The variations are purpose driven, and therefore, yes, you're going to have to reduce load, especially when it's positional work. You have to reduce that load when it's about maintaining brace. If you're not good at maintaining your brace throughout your deadlift, tempo work, fantastic thing to do. It gives you the time to focus on continue keeping your core braced, as well as the reduced load also means, hey, I've got a little bit more mental capacity to focus on there, versus as that load gets heavier and heavier, it gets a bit tougher to have as much mental focus on the technique side, because you're really trying not to die while moving weight.
Yeah, 100%. So don't not do the things that feel uncomfortable. I am personally guilty of needing to do more sumo work. But now that we brought it up, I'll make it a conscious decision to add sumo work into my training at a super lower load. Like for me, a working set in conventional deadlifts is like 170 for 3, 170 for 3 to 5. So for sumo, I'd probably drop it to like 140, 130 and play there and become proficient in it. So yeah.
Hundreds. And then lastly, when it comes to hinge work, another thing to really factor in is the amount of fatigue accumulated from hinge work. More often than not, you tend to find that people, like lumbar spine, tends to tap out before glutes and hamstrings. And so again, this is where we go, well, from a variation point of view, something like hip thrust. changes how the spine is loaded, and we can get additional hinge work in there to target glutes, target hamstrings, and not as much spinal loading. So again, pick when and where you're doing your hinge movements. You should generally, for most people, one heavy hinge a week is actually all you're going to do. If you're going to deadlift once a week. Then throw in 1 to 2 other hinge variations. And from there, manage it. See, can you handle the volume and load and no discomfort in the back? Great stuff. Start to slowly increase from there. But be careful with your hinge work. Deadlifting is seriously taxing on the body, seriously taxing on the central nervous system, which means that the recovery time needed is a fair bit longer. So you have to manage that weekly load to be able to make sure that you can push at a good effort level from week to week to week to get that improvement. So yeah, have a look at that. Things like, again, a hip thrust. Great way of getting some glute work, not loading the spine as much. And maybe, since you mentioned sumo versus conventional, maybe we can ask the public as well. For those of you that are powerlifters, I've always thought an interesting topic is whether or not you feel sumo and conventional should be classified as separate lifts, or whether you feel, because I mean, that in the powerlifting community, that's really, there's a lot of argument there. Someone will do a super good lift and they're like, oh, but it was just sumo and yeah,
Sumo is difficult. So when people say sumo is cheating, I'm like, I don't know how. It's so difficult.
Look, my view is I don't think one is more. It's more difficult. I think there is a great deal of preference. There are a lot of people that prefer conventional, and actually because conventional suits their mechanics better, and some people will prefer sumo because sumo. I do feel that actually at a competition point, I do actually feel that they should be classified as separate lifts. I do think there should be a category for those doing comp in sumo and there, because I also get the argument that it's difficult to compare them if they're competing against each other. Yes, both are a deadlift, but I don't think one is more difficult than the other, but I do understand that there are two different lifts. Even from a technical component, they're two different lifts, and I think having them as separate categories is not the worst idea, and could maybe actually settle some of the divide.
What about those few that have the one that's in the middle, the frog deadlift, where it's not exactly a sumo, but it's not exactly a conventional? Where is that asshole going to sit?
I would say that's still going to be within the realm of sumo. I would say that because I mean, and I have a lot of creds to the frog stance guys. Like I've on a lot of social platforms, a really incredible name in powerlifting at the moment, Colton, for example. I think that is a guy that I think and I've seen it even in comment sections, even people that don't like sumo go like, listen, this guy is, technically sumo, but the distance that bar travels is real. And again, I think it's just also, it's a variation that suits him. I am a bigger fan of the more frog stance because I do get it where people say, hey, some people take their sumo so wide that they are barely lifting the weight off the floor, and I do agree with that. So that's a personal preference, but it would still fall under the sumo category. How wide you want your sumo to be, but the moment your arms are no longer on the outside, the moment your arms are on the inside of your legs, that's sumo.
So powerlifters, this is your time to comment. Tell us, do you think sumo and conventional should be separate in a powerlifting comp, or should we keep it together?
I think that covers what we need to cover.
Yeah, so stay tuned for next week. We're going to do my favorite movement pattern, which is push work. It's like a little arms. And yeah, we'll check you there.
Cheers.